Today we actually are just continuing with the series that Graham began last week, Wise, God's Wisdom for Everyday Life. Last week, Graham spoke on raising wise kids. A little tongue-in-cheek, I announced the topic for this morning's message as Wisdom and Wrinkles. I actually have had a lot of fun with that title. My preaching professor used to say that a title was good if it would get somebody to get off the Fifth Avenue bus and come into your church. Well, when I told people the title, everybody was excited. They were smiling, they were asking questions, and they told me that they were going to come and hear the message. So I thought it was a good title. The only problem is that the title was misleading. Because first of all, our text, which comes from Proverbs 20:29, says nothing about wrinkles. Instead, it talks about a different physical feature associated with aging. It says, the beauty of the aged is their gray hair. The second reason my original title, Wisdom and Wrinkles, was misleading is because the proverb also says the glory of youth is their strength. The whole proverb reads, the glory of youth is their strength, the beauty of the aged is their gray hair. The proverb commends both young and old for a very specific physical attribute, gray hair and strength. But I think we got to wait a minute and ask an important question. Is the Bible really saying that gray hair is beautiful? Well, that's possible, but most women, when their hair gets gray, they run to the beauty parlor and get it covered up. Men are doing the same thing. They too are covering their gray hair these days. So I'm not sure that we really appreciate gray hair as a physical attribute. As a symbol, however, gray is packed with beautiful meaning. Gray is the color of complexity, of all that falls between the absolutes. It's the color of intellect, knowledge, and wisdom. It is a classic, refined, dignified, conservative color, the perfect neutral, if you will, that lives between the extremes of black and white. So let's stop covering the gray. Let's celebrate it. I know some in this congregation who during the pandemic have done just that. They now are coming back to church with beautiful gray and white hair. The rest of us are not so brave. But actually, in saying the beauty of the aged is their gray hair, Proverbs is not making a fashion statement, but holding up the value of reflective wisdom. Wisdom, like a good wine, matures over time. Gray hair, as such, is understood as a sign of wisdom, of someone's having lived a life worth living, a life full of experience that they have reflected upon. Great. So if the phrase, the beauty of gray hair, is to be understood as reflective wisdom, what about the phrase, the glory of youth is their strength? Is that symbolic too? Well, maybe. But physical strength of youth is in itself, I believe, an attribute. Let me explain how it is that I have come to that conclusion. We have, and I'm lifting it up because it's empty, these 5-gallon bottles of water in our home. And when my 6'2" young son Franklin lived with us, he would just pick these up, turn them over, and put them on the water dispenser. It was like nothing for him to do. But then he moved out. And the problem was, neither Marie nor I could move these bottles, and together we got more water on the floor than we did in the dispenser. And so what did we do? Well, we used a little wisdom, and we came up with 3-gallon bottles, which we can handle. That's not the only illustration I have of the value of the strength of youth. One day in our backyard, my sister Georgia's husband Jack, who was sick at the time, he fell in our backyard. And because he was sick, he couldn't get himself back up on his feet. So I went and got Charlie, his oldest son. Charlie came out, he looked at his dad, he leaned down, he picked him up single-handedly, held him in his arms like you would a baby, and walked him into the house. I absolutely marveled at Charlie's strength. But as wonderful as the physical strength of youth is, the strength of youth is more than physical. Robert Kennedy Jr., a man who died too young, talked and wrote of the attributes of youth eloquently when he said, "This world demands the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the life of ease." When I was 26, I remember going over with a group of youth to sleep on the beach in Half Moon Bay. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, the rain just came down in buckets. My sleeping bag was sopped. Everybody was up, running around in the rain. And in that moment, I, with a big smile on my face, said, "Someday, this won't be fun. But right now, we're having the time of our lives." We were on a youthful adventure. So I'm thinking that Solomon, in suggesting in this proverb, what he's suggesting is that youth and the old both have valuable assets. Older people bring to the table wisdom born of reflective experience. Young people bring to the table fresh perspective, openness to adventure, together with the strength and energy necessary to forge new pathways. It used to be that the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next wasn't an optional or a polite social practice, but instead it was an activity critical to the family and clan survival. Elders were the depositories and the conveyors of the accumulated wisdom of the community through myths, stories, and song. The passing of wisdom from one generation to the next was critical to ensure that the next generation both survived and progressed. If you wanted to know how to make the best bow and arrow ever, you asked Granddad, because he knew. He'd teach you. No need to reinvent the bow and arrow, the wheel, or fire. When life changes slowly, as it used to, The practical wisdom and accumulated knowledge of older members of the community remained relevant to the young. The youth respected and listened to their elders, not because it was a nice, polite thing to do, but because the elders in the community were the repository of the knowledge every generation needed to know. Youth needed to know what Granddad and Grandma knew, so they listened. But then Gutenberg changed all of that. With the invention of the printing press, the wisdom, traditions, knowledge, and stories from the past were transferred to the printed page. Literacy and education became more important. The library, not the elders, became the primary repository of wisdom and knowledge. Kids could read the stories, the Farmer's Almanac, or the Bible on their own. And they were given their own Bible as an important rite of passage. With Bibles in hand, young people also started moving away from parents and grandparents into the city. By the beginning of the 20th century, young people from Europe were immigrating to the United States by the boatload, away from access to the wisdom of those grandparents. My own grandparents came to this country at that time from Sweden. They were teenagers, young teens, 15 and 16. Everything their moms, dads, and grandparents were to teach them had already been passed on. They, however, brought the wisdom of their culture with them. They brought it with them, especially in the Bible. This is my grandparents' Bible that when I was ordained, my dad passed on to me. The wisdom of this book was so important to my grandparents that when they got here, they, together with some other Swedish people, were charter members of an Augustinian Lutheran church in Boston. When they retired to Florida, they founded another church. They also passed on the culture of their childhood to their children. My dad spoke Swedish fluently. He raised us here in California in a Swedish community in the Santa Cruz Mountains called Sveadal. And it's governed, and I love this title, by the Swedish American Patriotic League. But my dad wasn't so keen on the fire and brimstone teaching that he'd heard in church. With the advent of the industrial age during his lifetime and his entrepreneurial ability, he was more interested in reading the Wall Street Journal than the Bible. In a way, the Wall Street Journal became his mentor, kept him informed and up to date with the changes that were happening in society. As kids, he loved to take us on factory tours so we could see how things were being mass-produced. Because he was so into the industrial age and then the start of the technological advances, he had me buy a personal computer for our real estate company in 1981. The first time I accessed information remotely through a modem attached to that computer was in 1984. From that slow beginning, 1981, 1984, even I could keep up. But then there was this brisk march of progress from the industrial age to the tech era. Just look at this graph. It's a graph of time versus technological change. You start with the printing press, then the steam engine, the telegraph, the telephone, the car, the microprocessor, and then boom. Problem is, human adaptability hasn't kept up with the changes. Human adaptability, the black line on the graph that only gradually rises, doesn't keep up with that exponential curve of innovation. The huge gap that you see there between our ability to adapt and technological innovation has created a strong bias in our society for the wisdom of the digital native. Well, what's a digital native? Better yet, who are the digital natives? They are those who grew up biting, B-Y-T-I-N-G, from the apple in childhood. Whenever I personally experience the gap between my ability to adapt and technological change, I call upon Franklin. He's my favorite digital native. He had a keyboarding class in the first grade. He learned to read playing the video game Donkey Kong. I'm not kidding, he really did. To this day, he reads almost exclusively online. Here at church, Dan and Stephen possess this essential digital knowledge. They are our digital natives. We would not have survived the pandemic without them or Carrie. They got our worship services filmed and online every week. We didn't skip a beat as a church because these two wonderful digital natives were in place. Carrie and Paul Chapman were in our homes, setting up computers and Wi-Fi across the Bay Area, then teaching us how to access church online and YouTube through those devices. We did great as a community of faith, staying connected because we followed the lead of our digital natives. So that raises a question. Is the bottom line in all of this that the experiential wisdom of gray hair is obsolete and no longer of value? That the only wisdom that matters is digital wisdom? That old folks need to step aside, retire, and wait patiently to die? No, absolutely not. Not even in the startup world anymore is this thought to be wise. My favorite story of digital wisdom, the strength of youth, working together with gray hair wisdom, is the coming together of Airbnb's founders, Brian, Joe, and Nate. Obviously, they're digital natives, with hospitality guru Chip Conley with his gray hair. For those of you that don't know about Airbnb, it's basically a hotel accommodation booking app, not hotel, just an accommodation booking app that is an intermediary between those who want to rent out space and those who want to rent it. The idea was hatched in 2007 when the three digital native roommates rented out space in their own apartment to people who couldn't find lodging at a convention in San Francisco. They went to the store. They bought 3 air mattresses, served breakfast to their 3 guests who slept on the air mattresses. And from that beginning, air mattress bed and breakfast, now shortened to Airbnb, a whole new industry was born. Today, Airbnb has listings of more than 6 million properties in roughly 190 countries around the world, and is valued at somewhere between $30 and $100 billion, depending upon market fluctuations. The fun part of this story in the context of our proverb for this morning, the glory of youth is their strength, the beauty of the aged is their gray hair, is that Airbnb co-founder and CEO Brian Chesky and his 2 millennial co-founders approached that gray-haired Chip Conley to help them turn their emerging tech startup into an international giant. Brian had read Chip's latest book and wanted to access Chip's wisdom for his new country, his hospitality wisdom. Chip had an MBA from Stanford and 24 years of experience as founder and CEO of the 2nd largest boutique brick-and-mortar hotel brand in America. He had retired in 2007 as he went through a midlife crisis and in the middle of the Great Recession. It was in 2013 that Brian approached him. Brian wanted Chip to just come for 15 hours a week as his personal mentor and was going to give to him the title Head of Global Hospitality and Strategy. Well, it was a mouthful. It sounded good. But Chip was old school. Hospitality was his forte, but not technology. He had never used Airbnb. He didn't even have an Uber app on his phone. He didn't code. He was twice the age of the average Airbnb employee, and he would be reporting to a smart guy 21 years younger than him after having run his own company for 2 decades. Well, all of that was going to be a challenge. Chip, therefore, was a little intimidated, but at the same time, he was curious, and so he took the job. The first thing that Chip did was embrace the role. He was hired to be a mentor, not a CEO. So he took his CEO cap and he left it home. Once on the job, he was so tech challenged that he felt more like an intern than a mentor. He had, and he knew it, a lot to learn. Chip had to figure out his way to be both mentor and intern at the same time. Being gray hair wise, he began his mentorship by simply listening, watching intently, with as little ego or judgment as possible. He imagined himself in his mind as a cultural anthropologist, becoming intrigued and fascinated by his new habitat, the tech world. At first, that was actually all he did. He just listened and observed. But as he did so, he discovered that he actually did have something to contribute. he found that many of the young people could read the face of their cell phone, their iPhone, much better than the face of that person sitting next to them. It wasn't that they didn't understand emotions. The digital world is full of emojis, for goodness sakes. We use them all the time. But emojis don't create interpersonal face-to-face fluency. Chip had a storehouse of emotional intelligence that he had accumulated over time through experience. He had EQ wisdom, if you will, that these young executives needed if they were to become the great leaders that they had the potential to become. So, as humble mentor, after meetings, just sometimes, Chip would discreetly ask one of his fellow leaders if they were open to private feedback on how they were reading the emotions in the room, or how they were reading the motivations of particular engineers. Chip became their emotional intelligence mentor. As an intern, Chip wisely repackaged his bewilderment of technology into curiosity and gave it free rein. He asked so many why and what if questions. He became the appreciative student of the tech industry. Like a curious little kid, he genuinely inquired of the 21 to 26-year-old wise elders of the tech industry as to what this world was all about. In the process, he built up their confidence and a collaborative network environment. This was emotional intelligence at work. It was brilliant. It was wise. In this digital era in which we are presently living, libraries and elders aren't quite as popular as they used to be. But as the story of Airbnb illustrates, wisdom itself never grows old and is not limited to a particular age grouping. Boomers and millennials both have lots of wisdom to share with each other. If we are open to learn from each other and willing to share our wisdom and strengths, all will benefit. Old and young alike can become sage and student, mentor and intern. I think the key to this happening in the church and in the world is humility on both sides. The passage of Scripture that describes that humility best is Philippians 2, verses 5 to 11. I'm not going to read it to you today, but I will challenge you to go home, open your Bibles, and turn to Philippians 2, 5 to 11. The first thing this passage says that Jesus does is leave his divine credentials up in heaven. He is God, the wisest being in the universe, and he takes it off and leaves it on the table. He is then born into human form, becoming vulnerable. He comes as a baby. He grows up. He teaches in parables, asks lots of questions, leads by helping others to discover truth for themselves. In human form, he also stays the course, remaining humble and in place, no matter what the personal cost, which for him is death on a cross. He loves sacrificially. As a consequence of these first three movements, he then bridges the gap, the human divide, to the glory of God, affecting divine human reconciliation in his resurrection and ascension. If we are going to communicate and heal across generations, if we are going to put ageism to rest, if we are going to effectively communicate across the generational divide, then we need to follow Jesus. The first thing that needs to happen is for all of us to jettison our generational superiority. We need to get over ourselves, both young and old. Second, we need, like Jesus, to become vulnerable to the perspective of other generations. We need to come and listen appreciatively to the worldview of others. Like little children, asking lots of questions and seeking to understand. And sharing from that storehouse of our generational wisdom graciously, but only when invited to do so. We all need to be vulnerable, to see, understand, and appreciate the perspective of other generations. Third, like Jesus, when conversations get painful, when those conversations reveal the reality of the generational gap, and the pain of that gap, we need to stay the course, continue in love to be with those of other generations, and be willing to give sacrificially from our own storehouses, our own, from what it is that we want for the common good. Fourth and finally, following Jesus, as a result, new and glorious types of community will emerge in our church, in our families, in our work environments, as all generations are lifted up and appreciated and valued for their wisdom to the glory of God. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, we do thank you that you have given us wisdom through the ages. We thank you, too, that you have moved us into a new age of technological advancement. We know, gracious God, that we are, as human beings, slow to adapt. So help us, and help us generation to generation to move into the future in a way that gives glory to you, in a way that binds us together and values each and every person. In your Son's holy and precious name, amen.